They were promised salvation, but never returned. In 1889, St. Lillian's Convent ordered 37 sisters to till a barren field for a garden they believed would feed the hungry. 3 days later, the earth had swallowed them whole. Field was left untouched. The soil never grew a single blade of grass again, and the diocese still refuses to explain why the ground beneath St. Lillian's is warm. Even in winter, a thin wind drifts across a barren stretch of land. The ground is dark, cracked, brittle beneath the weight of nothing. Clouds hang low, not moving, as if the air itself has forgotten how to stir. The world feels paused, waiting. This place was never meant to grow for as long as anyone remembered. The soil behind the old convent refused life. Farmers said their seeds rotted within hours. Shepherds claimed the grass yellowed overnight if their flocks strayed too close. The ground, they said, had been marked. The locals whispered why they said lightning had struck this land during a storm in 1832. A storm so violent it split the church steeple in two. The soil turned black that night, they claimed, and every bird that circled overhead fell from the sky by morning. Since then, the land had been left alone, fenced with rotting wood, left to sit like a scar no one wanted to touch. But in the spring of 1889, St. Lillian's Convent made a decision. The sisters would turn the dead soil into a garden. The Mother Superior, an austere woman named Agnes Marrow, told the parish that the land's barrenness was not a curse, but a test. God does not bless the ground, she said, her voice firm beneath the vaulted ceilings of the chapel. He blesses the hands that labor upon it. The locals didn't believe her. Some turned their backs on the sisters when they walked through the village. Others whispered that Agnes had grown too ambitious, that her pride outweighed her caution, and a few, the oldest among them, refused to leave their homes once the first shovels broke the earth. The work began on a morning where even the birds seemed to keep their distance. 37 sisters, wrapped in habits that brushed the tops of their boots, carried wooden spades and baskets of seed to the edge of the field. The sky was gray, but not a single gust of wind moved the heavy air. The air felt suspended. Even the distant bells of St. Lillian's rang softer, as if muffled by something unseen. The first strikes of the spade came slowly. Each thud against the hardened soil echoed farther than it should have, carrying out into the flat emptiness. Around them, the sound of wood and earth, sharp and deliberate, filled the air like a slow chant. At first, nothing seemed strange. The sisters worked in pairs, reciting prayers under their breath as their spades broke the crust of the ground. They carved shallow trenches for seed, sweating despite the cool morning air. Each one believed, or tried to believe, that this was an act of faith, a miracle, waiting to unfold. But something wasn't right. As the morning stretched on, several of the sisters noticed the earth beneath their feet felt warmer, not hot, not enough to burn, just warm, like sun-warmed stone, though no sun had touched the ground that day. One novice, Sister Helena, paused, her boot sinking slightly deeper than expected into a patch of soil that looked no different than the rest. She swore she felt a faint tremor, as though something far below shifted when she pressed her weight into it. She didn't tell the others, not yet. Instead, she gripped her spade tighter and dug faster, whispering the same short prayer over and over, as if to steady herself. By midday, the field had begun to take shape. Long, uneven trenches cut through the black soil like veins. The sisters' habits were stained to the knees, streaked with the strange dark earth that clung to fabric as though it were damp. Though no moisture shone in the sunless light, the Mother Superior watched from a small rise at the edge of the property. Her hands were folded in front of her, her lips moving in silent prayer. She seemed calm, but her eyes never left the earth. Even when one of the villagers, an old man with a bent cane, called out that they should leave the land alone, she did not answer him. She only watched. And then, near the end of that first day, the sky grew heavier, not darker, not brighter, just heavier, as though the air itself thickened around the sisters as they worked. The breeze that had carried their chants away earlier in the day had died completely. The sound of their spades striking earth became sharper, echoing strangely across the flatland, almost as if it were bouncing back from somewhere deep below one's sister. No one remembered her name later, stopped her work, and stared at the horizon. She thought she heard something faint, a sound she could not place, like a hum, low and distant, rising from beneath the soil rather than from the air around her. Asked if anyone else heard it. No one answered. The Mother Superior told her to keep digging the garden. She said would be their offering, and as the sisters returned to their work, their spades moving in rhythm once more, the ground seemed to yield more easily than before. The hardened soil gave way in soft layers, as if the earth had been waiting for this moment. Every shovelful came faster, cleaner, the trenches deepening at an unnatural pace. No one said it aloud, but each sister felt it, the sense that they were not just turning soil, they were uncovering something. And as dusk fell, and the bells of St. Lillian's tolled faintly in the distance, a sudden gust of wind, the first of the day, swept across the field. It carried with it a smell none of them could name, something metallic, something old. The sisters did not speak of it, not yet, but as they gathered their tools and walked back toward the convent in the fading light, not one of them looked back at the trenches they had carved. The wind had stopped as quickly as it had come, and the air felt still again to still. The morning began with a stillness that felt unnatural. A gray sky, heavy and colorless, pressed down in the field behind St. Lillian's. The convent bell rang for prime, its tone swallowed almost immediately by the vast, unmoving air. Even the birds that circled the belfry seemed muted, their calls thin and distant, as if smothered by something unseen one by one. The 37 sisters stepped into the field, their habits brushed against the soil, leaving faint lines in the dark earth where no grass grew. Each carried a wooden spade, each carried a rosary looped around her wrist. None of them spoke. Not yet. The first sound was a prayer, low, steady. Mother Agnes began it, her voice slow, deliberate. The others followed, their voices weaving together until the field hummed with a chant meant to bless the work before them. But something wasn't right. Villagers who watched from the wooden fence said the prayer didn't sound like prayer at all. It wasn't the words. Those were familiar, sacred, carried on the tongues of every mass for centuries. It was the echo. Each verse, they said, came back to them twice first, as the sisters spoke it, and then again, faintly, as if the ground itself was repeating every line. At first, they thought it was the hills, the hills. Sound carries strangely on open land, but there were no hills here, just the flat stretch of black soil, marked only by the shallow trenches the sisters had begun the day before. The sisters heard it too. Some shifted, their weight uneasily, fingers tightening around the handles of their spades. One, a young novice named Sister Ruth, faltered mid-prayer and looked at the soil beneath her boots. She felt it, she said later, a faint pulse like a heartbeat, buried deep below. She didn't tell the others. Not then. The work began in earnest. The 37 formed two ragged lines, carving into the earth with practiced motions. Every thrust of the spade met resistance for a moment, then broke through. As though the soil softened beneath their touch, the trenches widened, the air grew heavier. The faint echoes rising behind each prayer, behind each strike of wood. An iron. A villager, Thomas Elroy, stood far back from the fence. He refused to step closer. Years later, he told his grandson that the sound of the spades reminded him of something he could never name. Not digging, not working, something slower, heavier, like breathing. He swore the ground was moving just slightly, as if the earth itself shifted each time the sisters struck it. And that's when he heard it. Not the chant, not the rhythm of labor, but something beneath it, a vibration, low and steady, rising up through the air like the faint hum of a distant organ. It lasted no more than a breath. Then it was gone. Back in the field, the sisters worked. On their prayers wavered, the harmony breaking as the hours passed. Some began to murmur rather than sing, as if their voices no longer belonged in the open air. Others moved their lips without sound at all. The Mother Superior never stopped her. Voice was the strongest. rising above the others, commanding. Unwavering, she walked along the trench lines as the others dug, her eyes fixed on the ground. Every so often, she would stoop, pinch a handful of soil, and let it fall slowly through her fingers. Her expression never changed, not when the soil clung damply to her skin, not when the air around her seemed to throb with the rhythm of the spades by midday. The field was a lattice of trenches and mounds. The sisters' habits were heavy with streaks of black earth, their hands blistered, their lips dry, though the air held a strange humidity, a damp warmth rising from the ground itself. One of the older sisters, Sister Mary Clare, finally spoke what many had been feeling. She leaned on her spade, her breath uneven, and whispered to no one in particular, "The ground feels alive." No one answered her, but several slowed their digging. Several glanced at the Mother Superior. She only raised her hand for them to continue, and so they did, hour by hour, until the sun sagged behind the gray veil of cloud. The work continued. The echoes deepened. Each word of prayer came back slower now, almost drawn out, as though the soil itself was learning to speak. Even the villagers stopped watching by evening. The fence line was empty. No one wanted to hear it anymore. When the bell at St. Lillian's tolled for vespers, the sisters laid down their tools. Their prayers ceased. The echoes did not. For several seconds after the last voice fell silent, the faint repetition carried on, a ghost of the chant. Fading into the ground, the sisters stood still, their breaths loud in the sudden quiet. No one moved. No one spoke then. Just as quickly as it began, the echo died. The air stilled. The field fell silent, and in that silence, every one of them felt it, the faintest tremor beneath their feet, like something vast and slow, shifting far below. None of them dared to speak of it on the walk back to the convent. But Sister Ruth, the youngest, kept glancing over her shoulder at the black soil, at the trenches that now ran deep and narrow, like open wounds in the earth. She swore just before they reached the convent gates. She felt the ground throb one last time, a slow, deliberate pulse, like a single heartbeat, and then it stopped. A thin fog drifted low over the field that morning. It clung to the edges of the trenches the sisters had dug, softening their sharp lines, turning the land into a pattern of gray wounds. The convent bell rang again, distant and hollow, its tone fading too quickly in the still air. There was no wind, not a sound, but the bell, and the soft crunch of boots as the sisters returned to the soil. They began to dig before the light had properly broken. The sky was pale, clouded, holding no trace of color. Each breath they took hung in the air, longer than it should have, as though even the fog was reluctant to move for a time. The only sound was the steady rhythm of their labor, the scrape of spade against earth, the faint rustle of fabric as they shifted along the trenches, the murmured prayers, too low to carry, spoken more out of habit than faith now. But something wasn't right. It was Sister Margaret who heard it first. Her spade, driven deep into the earth, struck something that did not sound like soil, not the dull thud of packed ground, not the grind of rock. The sound was sharper, stranger, a hollow reverberation, as if she had struck the lid of an empty vessel. She froze, both hands gripping the spade, listening. The sisters near her paused as well. The sound had carried, faint but distinct, through the trench. Not one of them spoke. Then Sister Ruth's spade hit the same note, a hollow echo, deeper this time, almost musical in its timbre. The earth gave slightly beneath her feet when she shifted her weight, the soil rising in a faint, unnatural swell around the blade. The others began to strike carefully, testing, listening. Each impact sent a vibration through the trenches, subtle but unmistakable. It wasn't wood, it wasn't stone. It was something beneath them, something empty. Mother Superior stepped down into the trench, her boots pressed into the dark soil, leaving no imprint despite its looseness. She placed her hand on the shaft of Sister Margaret's spade and drove it down again. Hard the sound came once more, low, resonant, a hollow body buried somewhere far below, too deep to see, too loud to ignore. Sisters glanced at one another, their faces pale in the cold morning light. No one spoke, no one dared to ask what they had found. The Mother Superior raised her hand, and the spades lifted as one. They kept digging by late afternoon. The trenches were deeper, but whatever they had struck remained hidden. The hollow echoes came more often now, though softer, as if retreating into the distance. The sisters worked in silence, no longer chanting, their breaths loud and uneven in the still air that night. The unease did not leave them. Inside the convent, the halls were quiet, lit only by thin candles that seemed to burn slower than usual. The sisters took to their narrow beds, folding their hands over their chests as they whispered evening prayers. Some slept quickly, most did not around midnight. Sister Helena sat up. In her cell, she swore she heard something through the stone floor. Not movement, not voices in the hall. A sound deeper than that, a faint, rhythmic murmur, like a choir buried far below the convent, singing through the layers of soil and rock. She rose, pressing her ear to the cold flagstones. The sound was there, distant layered A, chant she couldn't recognize. The words were warped, too low to decipher, but the cadence was unmistakable. It pulsed softly, as if carried on some slow, unseen current beneath the earth. She told Sister Ruth, who listened beside her. Ruth heard it too. Others joined them, kneeling on the cold floor. In silence, their faces lit by the flicker of a single candle. Each one heard it, a faint, steady chant, not loud enough to be certain, not clear enough to understand. But there they brought it to Father Donnelly the next morning, the oldest priest in the parish. His hands mottled with age, his voice low and deliberate. He listened to their account with his eyes half closed, nodding only once. When they finished, he gave a single answer. It was the wind, but there had been no wind that night. There hadn't been wind for 3 days. The sisters returned to the field that afternoon. Their spades struck the soil again, breaking the silence. The hollow sounds came, fainter now, as though whatever lay beneath had sunk deeper into the earth. The chant did not return that day, but as dusk settled over St. Lillian's, a shadow fell across the far edge of the field, long, thin, stretching toward the trenches. Though nothing stood behind it to cast it, and when the convent bell rang for evening prayer, the echo that followed sounded wrong. It did not return from the air. It came from below. The sun had not broken the clouds in 3 days. The field behind St. Lillian sat in a dim, permanent dusk, the air thick with a chill that clung to skin. The trenches, now deep and winding, cut the black soil into uneven shapes that looked less like a garden and more like open wounds. By the third evening, the sisters moved slower. Their voices were hoarse from the endless murmurs of prayer, their faces pale beneath the gray light. Even their tools, once clean, were streaked black with earth that never seemed to dry, leaving their hands smelling faintly of iron. But something wasn't right. It began with the air. As the sisters dug deeper, shaping the last trench, a soft gust rose from the hole beneath them. It was warm, too warm. It brushed their cheeks and wrists like the exhale of something buried far below. The sisters froze for a moment. None moved. They felt the warmth again, faint, steady, carrying with it a smell that turned their stomachs. Not rot, not sulfur, a mix of iron and something sweeter, a smell like incense, burned too long, clinging to fabric and throat one by one. They set their spades aside. Some crossed themselves, others whispered their prayers louder, as if louder words could drive back the air itself. The Mother Superior descended into the trench, her face unreadable. She crouched, holding her hand over the hollow, feeling the faint breath rising. She did not speak. She only stood, signaling for the sisters to continue their work. And so they did. Every strike of the spade now came with hesitation. The earth seemed softer, looser, as if each layer they uncovered had already been turned before. The warmth pulsed at intervals, almost in rhythm with their digging, like a slow, shallow breathing that night. Unease followed them back to the convent. The stone halls felt colder than usual. Though the air outside had remained unnaturally still, the sisters ate in silence. The clang of spoons on tin plates sounded too loud. bouncing strangely along the refectory walls, as though the space around them were larger than before. Some of them did not sleep, others tried, their dreams quick and shallow, disturbed by faint whispers they could not place. It was in those hours, long after Compline, that Sister Helena awoke. She sat up sharply in her narrow bed, her chest heaving. The candle at the far end of the hall flickered once, then steadied. Her breath hung in the cold air, though the stones beneath her bare feet felt warm, almost feverish. When she placed them on the floor, and that's when she heard their name, whispered not from the hall, not from any room nearby. From beneath, it was soft, drawn out as if spoken through a barrier. The syllables stretched, each one heavy with a wet hiss, the sound pulling up through the floor like a voice traveling. Along a hollow pipe she froze. Her hands gripped the thin blanket so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The voice came again, fainter now, drawn away into the stone, as if whatever spoke had retreated back into the earth. Helena screamed. The sound tore through the convent, bouncing down the silent halls, waking every sister from their uneasy sleep. Footsteps echoed as doors opened, candles lit, whispers rising into the cold air. They found her crouched on the floor beside her bed, shaking, clutching the wooden cross around her neck. She could not speak at first. Her mouth moved, but no sound came. When she finally did, her words were broken, stammered, barely louder than breath. "It knows my name." The others pulled her into her bed, covering her with a heavy wool blanket, whispering prayers over her. But few of them returned to sleep. Most stayed awake, sitting at the edges of their beds, listening. The convent was silent. For the rest of the night, no voices, no wind, just the occasional crack of the wooden beams settling in the cold yet beneath that silence. Some swore they could hear it, a faint sound, deep and irregular, the same pulsing warmth they had felt in the trenches, rising now through the stone floor, carrying a smell so faint it seemed imagined, a trace of incense clinging to the edge. Of every breath, none of them spoke of it in the morning. None of them had to each sister, as she walked toward the field that day, felt the same thing. The earth behind St. Lillian's was no longer still. It was alive, and it was breathing a pale. Mist clung to the field on the fourth morning. It hung low over the black soil, drifting just high enough to blur the trenches the sisters had carved from the convent windows. It looked as though the ground itself was smoking, thin streams of vapor rolling along the channels, vanishing where the earth cut too deep. The bell rang for prime. Its sound felt different that day, not louder, not softer, but strained, as though the tone had split into two notes, ringing slightly out of unison. The sisters heard it as they made their way toward the field, their rosaries clicking softly against their habits. None spoke. Each footfall on the damp earth landed heavier than the last that morning. They did not dig. They gathered in the open space between the trenches for Mass. The Mother Superior stood at the center, her hands folded, her eyes fixed on the pale mist that seemed to cling tighter as the sisters took their places. The villagers who had been watching from a distance stepped closer to the fence, curious. It was not often that Mass was held outdoors. The sisters began to sing soft, measured, their voices rising carefully into the still air. The hymn was familiar, a plea for blessing, a call for divine presence over the labor of their hands. But something wasn't right. The witnesses at the fence heard it first. The hymn did not sound whole, each voice carried clearly, but together. They didn't blend. The notes overlapped, just slightly out of time, as though each sister was singing to a rhythm only she could hear. The effect was subtle at first, a faint staggering in the melody. Then it deepened. Some voices dragged a note. Too long, others ended too early. A few seemed to echo after the others had stopped, as if another singer, faint, hidden, carried the hymn beyond its natural end by the second verse. It no longer sounded like a choir. It sounded like a gathering of voices in separate rooms, all reciting the same hymn, but never quite meeting Thomas Elroy. The old man who had refused to step into the field days before told his son later that he could swear he heard more than 37 voices that morning, not louder, not clearer, just more shadows of voices, trailing behind the living ones, repeating phrases a fraction too late, too soft to name. The sisters noticed it too. Some glanced at each other mid-hymn, their lips faltering, unsure if they had lost the rhythm or if the rhythm itself had changed. The Mother Superior did not move. Her eyes stayed fixed on the mist curling along the edges of the trenches, her mouth still shaping each word, her voice unwavering even as the hymn unraveled around her. When the hymn ended, silence fell so quickly it felt wrong. No wind, no distant crows, not even the faint hum of the soil that had become so constant over the past 2 days. The air was simply empty, and then the bell rang. Its tone broke the stillness like a blade, sharp and dissonant. Calling them back for their midday meal, the sisters turned, one by one, gathering their things, their feet dragging slightly as they moved across the damp earth. But no one answered the bell. The villagers at the fence waited. They watched the sisters move across the field, their figures fading into the pale mist as they neared the convent gates. The bell rang again, longer this time. The sound seemed to bend in the air, echoing not outward, but downward, a faint resonance rising from the earth below. The gates of the convent closed. The field grew still, and though the bell stopped, the villagers swore they could still hear it, a faint, slow toll, distant and muted, as if ringing beneath the soil itself. No one had seen the sisters again. The windows of St. Lillian's were dark. The refectory, usually lit for the evening meal, held no glow. No voices drifted from the chapel, only the faint smell of incense, carried on a breeze no one felt, slipping across the field and curling through the village streets. Thomas Elroy stayed awake that night, sitting by his window, staring toward the silent convent in the early hours. Just before dawn, he swore he heard them again, not singing this time, praying. 37 voices, layered, fractured, as if carried on air, or through the earth itself. When he opened his shutters, the field behind St. Lillian's was still blanketed in mist, and just before the first light touched the horizon, he saw it a single dark figure, standing in the center of the trenches, motionless, watching the convent. And then, as the light began to rise, it sank, not into shadow, not into fog, straight down, as though the earth itself had opened to take it back. And morning the searchers arrived. The fog had not lifted it, hung low over the convent, weaving between the bare trees and coiling around the bell tower like smoke. The field behind St. Lillian's lay still, its trenches barely visible through the pale veil. The only sound was the creak of wagon wheels as the search party came up the dirt road. They had expected to find a scene of struggle, signs of where the sisters had gone. Something to explain why 37 voices had vanished after the last mass. But the field was empty. No figures moved between the trenches. No tools leaned against the mounds of soil. Only the pits remained, deep, black, their edges softened by mist and the faint smell of iron that clung to the air despite the morning chill. At the edge of the largest pit, someone saw them first. 37 habits, folded with care, stacked in a neat line along the lip of the trench, each one clean, dry, untouched by soil, though no one could say how the rosaries lay atop them, coiled like pale veins, the crosses resting gently against the fabric. But something wasn't right. The soil beneath the searchers' boots was warm, not the surface, but deeper, a heat that rose through the soles of their shoes, like the faint breath of something buried below. And yet, there were no footprints. The ground, soft and damp as it was, held no sign that anyone had walked away. Father Donnelly, the oldest among them, crouched by the folded habits. His hands trembled as he reached out to touch one. The fabric was cold, too cold, as if it had been left in frost. Though no frost had touched the field, he let it fall back into place and whispered a single prayer beneath his breath. The others spread out. Searching, they checked the convent first. Every room was undisturbed, beds made, candles unlit. The chapel doors stood open, but no hymn, no echo of voices lingered there anymore. Back in the field, Thomas Elroy stayed near the pit. He could not bring himself to walk the trenches. He said later that he felt something when he stood too close, a faint vibration, pulsing through the soil, steady as a slow, distant breath, and that's when he heard it, not words, not voices, a single sound, faint but deliberate, rising from somewhere far beneath the earth, like a bell, but wrong, the tone was lower than any bell he'd ever heard, stretched and drawn, as though echoing through a hollow space that had no end. He backed away, his breath visible in the still, heavy air. The others returned, their faces pale, their voices hushed. They had found nothing, no tracks leading into the woods, no disturbance in the soft soil beyond the garden. It was as if the 37 sisters had vanished where they stood, leaving only their garments behind. The searchers argued quietly about what to do next. Some wanted to dig, others refused, glancing at the pits with something closer to dread than reluctance. In the end, they marked the field with stakes and rope, leaving the habits untouched, and returned to the village to report what they had seen by dusk. The mist had thickened again, rolling low along the ground until the trenches disappeared entirely from view. Only the tops of the stakes remained visible, jutting out like the ribs of something buried. Thomas Elroy did not sleep that night. He sat by his window once more, staring toward the faint silhouette of St. Lillian's against the dim horizon. The village was silent, the streets empty, and just before the bell struck midnight, he swore he saw a single flicker of light deep within the mist, where the trenches lay, not a flame, not a lantern, a glow, faint and unmoving, pulsing softly in time with something far below the earth. The bell never rang, but the sound of it, low, stretched, distant, drifted through the still night air. All the same, a month passed before the first truck arrived, flat gray, no markings. It came before sunrise, wheels crunching across frost-hardened dirt, its engine whispering low through. The fields behind it came 3 men, not locals, dressed in long black coats, faces hidden by scarves, eyes shielded behind tinted glasses. Despite the heavy clouds and lack of sun, they did not speak to anyone in the village. They drove straight past the chapel, past the storehouses, and stopped at the edge of the garden, behind St. Lillian's. Then they began to build a fence, tall, industrial, sectioned off the entire field. No gates, no signs, no warning, just a barrier of steel, sealed tight with heavy wire, surrounding what was once the convent's hopeful garden. By evening, the work was done. The trucks left, but the men remained that night. Villagers saw them moving through the mist with flashlights, always in pairs, always silent. They patrolled the perimeter slowly, pausing often to press gloved hands against the frozen fence. One man, seen only once, stood at the center of the field near the largest trench. He carried no light, only a small book, bound in black cloth, and for nearly an hour he stood unmoving, whispering. The next day, word came from the Diocese. The garden was a failed project, an overzealous attempt at self-sufficiency. The sisters had been reassigned. Their absence, the letter claimed, was not a matter of concern, but something wasn't right. The village priest, Father Donnelly, was given a new assistant that same week, a young man, recently ordained, who had never stepped foot in the valley before. He rarely spoke. He spent most nights walking the road toward St. Lillian's. Standing at the edge of the fence with a rosary clutched in both hands, he never entered. Villagers began to notice changes. The soil along the fence line remained warm. Even after hard frosts, snow melted before it touched the ground. Animals avoided the area entirely. Dogs refused to walk that path. Cattle grew restless when led nearby, their eyes wild, their breath fast at night. Lights flickered in the field, faint glows, steady and cold. Not firelight, not lamps, just pale illumination rising in thin beams through the mist. And always the smell, faint, metallic incense, a constant undercurrent in the wind. Even on days when the wind did not move, rumors spread quickly. A boy named Eli swore he saw a figure kneeling behind the fence at dusk, its hands buried in the soil, its face turned upward, and when the boy looked again, it was gone, but the mist where it had knelt lingered longer than it should have. twisting in strange, slow spirals. A woman, passing late one night, said she heard chanting not from the field, but from beneath it. The diocese sent another letter. It warned against idle speculation, accused the village of spreading heresy. And then, silence. No one from the church spoke of it again, but the priests stationed at St. Lillian's remained. Not residents, just sentries, men in dark coats, changing every few weeks, always arriving just before sundown, always gone by morning. What they were guarding, no one would say, but the field never cooled even in midwinter. When the ground froze solid just beyond the steel fence, the air above, the garden remained strangely warm, unmoving, as if something beneath the soil had taken one long breath and never let it go. And that's when Thomas Elroy heard it again, the bell, not from the chapel, from the ground, soft at first, low, a single note stretched wide, as though struck beneath layers of soil and stone. He turned away. He stopped walking that road, refused to even look toward the convent. He said the sound wasn't just heard, it was felt in the chest, behind the teeth. A hum too low to name years. Past grass refused to grow within the fence. The trenches, once sharp, softened with time, but never filled. Rain ran around them instead of into them. Birds flew above, but never landed. And some nights, villagers still saw shadows, tall figures, unmoving, standing behind the wire just after midnight. Not priests, not soldiers, still just watching. The warmth remains to this day, no matter the season, no matter the weather. The garden never cools, and no one has dug there since, not because they were told not to, but because the earth no longer feels like earth. It feels like breath, held waiting. The convent halls were silent after the sisters disappeared. Only 2 beds remained occupied, 2 novices, too weak to work, their bodies still recovering from a fever that had struck them days before the digging began. Their names were Clara and Miriam. They had been spared from the trenches. They had not set foot in the black soil, but in the nights that followed, something else began to take hold. The first sound came just after Matten's sister Agnes, the caretaker left behind, awoke to the faint hum of voices. She rose from her cot and followed it down the corridor. The voices grew clearer as she approached the infirmary, rhythmic, low, rising and falling like a chant. She opened the door slowly, the hinges groaning against the still air. Clara was asleep. Miriam. 2 both lay pale and motionless in their beds, their lips moving, their throats trembling with sound. But the words were wrong. Not Latin, not any prayer Agnes had ever heard. She stood in the doorway for nearly a minute, clutching her rosary so tightly, the beads cut into her hand. The voices were soft, almost tender, but each syllable felt strained, pulled from somewhere deep, as if their lungs were drawing air from below the floor rather than above it. But something wasn't right. When she stepped closer, she felt it. The air around their beds was warm, faintly humid. Despite the chill of the stone room, the smell of incense, stale, heavy, hung faintly above them, and though both girls remained still, the rhythm of their voices didn't falter. It was as though they were breathing and speaking on a cycle separate from their bodies. The next night, the sound returned, louder this time, low syllables, rising and breaking in patterns too structured to be nonsense, but too foreign to place. Agnes wrote them down by hand, repeating the sounds under her breath until the shapes of the words began to stick. She showed the notes to Father Donnelly the next morning. He told her to burn them, and that's when he heard it. The voices, not in the convent this time, in the church, as he prepared for prime, a low rolling hum, building beneath the hymn he sang as he lit the candles. He froze, the flame in his hand trembled, guttered, nearly died. The hum stopped. He left the sanctuary dark. Within days, the novices stopped responding. When spoken to, their eyes opened. When food was brought, but they did not blink. Their mouths formed no words except in sleep. When the murmurs returned like clockwork, always the same cadence, always the same strange syllables, rising and fading as if answering a question only they could hear, the diocese intervened quietly. 2 men arrived in the night, plain clothes there, collars tucked away, No prayers, no rites, no ceremony. They carried no supplies except 2 small cases, sealed tight. Their surfaces marked only by a simple black cross. Clara and Miriam were led from their beds before dawn. Each was wrapped in a gray wool cloak. Neither resisted, they did not speak, not even as they were guided out the convent doors, their bare feet silent against the stone. But those who watched swore the murmurs continued even as they walked, faint, rhythmic, pulsing like a second breath beneath their silence. No carriage was seen, no wagon. The girls were led down the back path toward the river, where the mist never lifted and vanished into the trees. By morning, their beds had been stripped, their few belongings, rosaries, prayer books, letters, had been burned in the courtyard. The official record said they had been transferred to a cloister in another province. No name, no location, no return address for correspondence. But Father Donnelly knew better. He stayed awake for 3 nights after their removal, seated at his window, staring toward the empty convent garden beyond the fence each night. Just before dawn, he heard it again, not voices this time, a single note low drawn resonating through the earth, as though struck deep below the trenches. And on the 4th night, he swore he saw 2 shadows, tall, narrow, drifting along the inside of the fence, not walking, gliding, each one moving in perfect rhythm, pausing only at the edge of the largest trench before sinking down, vanishing into the mist as if the soil itself had opened. The murmurs never returned to the convent, but in the weeks that followed, some villagers began to whisper at night, when the mist was heavy and the wind had gone still. They could hear it on the road near St. Lillian's stew, voices whispering in unison, not prayers, not words anyone knew, just a rhythm slow, even like breathing. The winter of 1954 came colder than most. Snow lay heavy on the convent roof, clinging in drifts to the bell tower, softening the angles of the iron fence around the field behind St. Lillian's. The garden had lain untouched for decades. Its trenches, long since collapsed, were buried beneath years of frost and overgrowth. But beneath the brittle grass, the soil still carried warmth. Always the diocese had ordered an expansion. A new wing for the convent foundations needed to be dug where the old garden had been. Few locals agreed to the work, so men from neighboring towns were brought in. They knew little of the history. They had not heard the stories. On the first morning, the crew arrived before dawn. The fog that had lingered for years was still there, rolling along the fence line like a tide. The foreman, Harold Briggs, noted the oddity, but said nothing. He needed the job finished. He told his men the ground was soft from groundwater, told them the warmth was nothing unusual, but something wasn't right by midday. As the first trench was cut, one of the laborers, a young man named Alan Price, stopped swinging his pick. He stared down at the earth beneath his boots, not at the soil itself. At the sound it made, he swore he heard something, not the scrape of tools, not the wind hum faint, low, pulsing up through the soles of his boots like the distant toll of a bell, muffled by miles of earth. When he knelt to press his ear to the ground, he felt heat radiating upward, steady, unnatural. That's when he heard it, voices, not words, not even tones at first, just the cadence of many throats moving at once, rising and falling in waves, too measured to be coincidence, like a choir, somewhere deep below, their rhythm precise, deliberate, almost liturgical. He staggered back, dropped his pick. The others noticed. Within moments, every man had stopped working. Some stood frozen, listening, others back toward the fence, shaking their heads, muttering, their voices sharp in the heavy air brakes. Tried to steady them. He crouched by the trench himself, pressing his palm to the dark soil. It felt alive beneath his hand, warm, subtly shifting, as though breath moved somewhere far below. He listened. The sound was faint, but clear, now chanting. Dozens of voices layered, echoing, not words he could name, not a language he had ever heard. But with each rise of the chant, the soil beneath him seemed to pulse slowly, rhythmically, like a living lung drawing air from the earth itself. He told his men to leave their tools. They did not argue. They fled the field, crossing the fence without a word, their boots silent on the frost-hardened ground. By the time they reached the road, most refused to even look back that night. Briggs met with the diocesan overseers. He told them what they had heard, the warmth, the voices, the shifting earth. The overseers listened in silence, their faces still, their hands folded on the table. When he finished, it gave him a single instruction: do not return the next morning. New crews arrived, not builders, not locals, men in dark coats, their trucks unmarked, carrying nothing but heavy machinery and barrels of quick-setting concrete. The field was cleared by sundown. The trenches were not dug further. No soil was removed. Instead, the entire garden was flooded with concrete, poured until the pits, the grass, even the fence posts were buried under a gray, seamless slab. The air grew still that evening. No mist rolled over the new surface. No warmth rose from the ground. For the first time in decades, the field felt cold. But Briggs, who watched from the road, swore he still felt it. Not warmth, not vibration, a hum, faint, so low it seemed to press against his teeth rather than his ears. And just before he turned away, as the last truck pulled off the site, he thought he heard something beneath the thick new shell of concrete, distant, soft, a single note, a bell, ringing once slow stretched, as if carried upward through miles of hollow earth. The wind picked up, the sound faded, and the garden was never dug again, not because of the stories, not because of the church, but because no one who stood on that slab for more than a moment could ignore it. The feeling, not warmth, not sound, something deeper, as if, beneath the weight of concrete and soil, something still breathed, slowly, patiently, waiting for the ground to open once more. Ruins of St. Lillian sit half swallowed by the earth's stone walls, weathered and broken, tilt against a backdrop of skeletal trees. The bell tower, long collapsed, lies in pieces across the frozen courtyard, its iron frame rusted through, its bell buried somewhere beneath the soil. Behind the ruins, past what remains of the chapel and cloisters, a flat expanse of concrete stretches across the earth, gray, featureless, a scar where the garden once was. It has been nearly 70 years since the church sealed the ground. Since they poured the concrete and abandoned the site, no one has touched it since. Not the diocese, not the town. Even trespassers hesitate to step across the slab. And yet, the air above, it is not like the rest of the valley in winter, when the surrounding earth is brittle and the breath of the trees turns to frost. A faint haze lingers above the slab. Not mist, not smoke, just a shimmer, visible only when the wind stills, and beneath a gloved hand, pressed flat to the concrete, there is warmth. But something wasn't right. In 2019, a team of investigators came to St. Lillian's. Not thrill-seekers professionals. They brought seismic microphones, parabolic dishes, and thermal scanners, setting their equipment along the perimeter of the slab. They did not expect to find anything by the third night. They wanted to leave at 2:13 a.m. The first reading came through one of the seismic microphones, buried a few inches beneath the slab's edge, began to hum. Not static, not wind, a rhythm low, steady, like the pulse of a distant drum buried deep below. The team leaned in, turned the gain up, listened. That's when they heard it, voices faint, layered, not singing, not speaking in any tongue they could place, just a slow, resonant cadence, words forming and folding over themselves like a chant with no beginning and no end. Each syllable echoed through the earth, as though carried by vast, hollow chambers far beneath their feet. They froze. One of them whispered, asking if it was feedback. Another shook his head. The signal was clean. It was coming from below. They recorded for 17 minutes before the sound cut off, not fading, stopping, as though a door had closed far beneath the slab. They did not sleep. That night, the next morning, they packed their gear and left without speaking to the locals. The recordings, they said, were lost to equipment failure, but the villagers know the truth. Some have heard it themselves, standing at the edge of the concrete, long after dark, when the wind has gone still. A vibration hums through the ground, faint, so low it seems to travel not through the ears, but through the bones of the jaw and chest. Sometimes it is only a pulse, other times a voice more than 1 dozen's, rising and falling in a rhythm no one dares to name. The soil beneath the slab is still warm, even in January, when the frost lingers on every other surface, when the ground beyond cracks beneath a boot heel. The slab sweats faintly. Thin lines of condensation trail across its surface in the cold, as if the earth itself is breathing slowly, patiently. No one knows how deep the concrete goes. Some say 10 feet, others swear was poured until it met bedrock. But those who have placed their hands flat against it claim to feel something else. Not movement, not heat, a subtle, rhythmic pressure, like the distant echo of a heartbeat, or the rise and fall of lungs too vast to imagine. Last winter, a hunter named Paul Renner swore he saw something he had been tracking deer through the woods beyond the convent when the wind died and the snow stopped falling. From the ridge, he saw a figure tall, still standing at the center of the slab. It did not move, did not turn when he called out. When he blinked, it was gone, but the haze over the slab lingered, curling upward in shapes that did not break apart with the breeze. Paul does not walk that ridge anymore. He says the ground feels wrong beneath it, soft, though frozen, as if the earth itself has not settled today. St. Lillian's remains abandoned. The ruins sag further each year, stones collapsing into the underbrush, the paths overgrown, but the slab behind it remains untouched, smooth, unbroken, a sealed mouth in the center of the valley. And still, some nights, when the wind dies and the air holds its breath, you can hear a low hum, distant, but certain, rising from beneath the earth, layered voices weaving in tones too deep to trace. Not angry, not desperate, just patient waiting, and for those who linger too long, kneeling close with an ear pressed to the concrete. The sound changes. It begins to match their breath, their pulse, their own heartbeat, until they cannot tell where the murmurs end. And where they begin, faith can sanctify soil, but it can also awaken what was buried beneath it. The diocese has sealed St. Lillian's for good, but if you stand near the slab on a winter night and place your hand on the earth, you'll feel it breathe, and you may hear voices calling for someone to finish the garden.